Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, HQIM plus implementation equals impact. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my slideshow here. And just a thumbs up from everyone that you can see it. Okay, awesome. So welcome. Today we're going to be discussing conditions for success in high quality materials implementation. Today's webinar will be about 1 hour, alternating with presentation. So you'll see some slides on the screen, but we will also have a discussion with our panelists who I will be introducing in a moment. If you have any questions for us, please use the chat to message our host, and someone is moderating the chat, and hopefully we'll be able to answer some of those questions towards the end. Your questions will be anonymous, and there will be a recording made available to you by the end of the week. So please find, the recording and additional resources at pivotlearning.org/resources. So today we have a wonderful panel here to discuss HQIM with you today. First, I'm going to introduce Jamar McDaniel. He is the Director of Adoption and Implementation at Pivot Learning. And I'm going to allow him to say hello to you and to tell you a little fun fact about himself.
Hello. Thank you so much, Nanika. Again, I am Jamar McDaniel, and I'm excited to be here. I support our team around our curriculum adoption and implementation. And I think one fun thing about me, so you see me sitting down, I'm 6'2", actually. Some say I look like I'm 6'4", but many people find it funny that I taught kindergarten for my first year of teaching, which was one of my most favorite years of teaching, but everyone really came below, very, 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 very low to me, but everyone finds that very funny.
Yes, the kids are always so amused with our height. I'm actually kind of tall too, so I totally understand. Next, we have Jignasha Pandya, and she is also a Director, Adoption and Implementation for Pivot Learning. And I would love for you to be able to share with us some interesting facts that our audience may like to know.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I work alongside Jamar at Pivot Learning in our curriculum adoption portfolio. And a fun fact about me is that I'm an almost hyper polyglot. So it's more like the fifth language is 2 languages combined, because I don't think I can claim proficiency anymore, but I speak 5 languages, which makes me a hyper polyglot.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Jignasha, for sharing.
Yep.
And next, we have our wonderful district leader, Sean True. He is the Senior Director of Educational Services with Monterey Peninsula Unified School District, or do you just say MPUSD, right? So Sean, please come off mute and let us know a little something about yourself.
Thanks, Danica. We go by Monterey Peninsula or MPUSD around here. I'd love to share that my fun fact is that I'm as tall as Jamar or as well-spoken as Jignasha, but that is not the case. My fun fact really is that besides being a district leader, I also like to be an artist in my spare time. So kind of a folk artist. I like to make, sculpt, and paint things. So that's my fun fact for the day.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sean. And last but certainly not least, my colleague, Stephanie Lawkins, who is the Vice President of Educator Success for Curriculum Associates. And I'd love for her to come off mute and share some interesting facts about herself.
Oh, goodness. Hi, everybody. My fun fact, this is building off the arts theme from Sean and also off our math theme, is I love to knit, but only really complicated patterns. I find it like much more relaxing to follow complex patterns than simple patterns.
Interesting. Now, I have never knitted. I've always said that I wanted to try, but I have a feeling I won't be trying to do anything as complex as you seem to be able to do. Thank you so much for that, Stephanie. And again, my name is Nanika Brathwaite. I am a National Director with Curriculum Associates, National Director of Content and Implementation, and I hail from Brooklyn, New York. And an interesting fact about me is I often said that I was allergic to running when it came to any kind of form of exercise. Don't get me running, but eventually I kind of gave in, and in 2011 started running long distance and has since completed quite a few half marathons, about 20 half marathons and 2 New York City marathons to date. So there is something to be said about, you know, having that closed mindset, thinking you couldn't do anything, and then even allowing yourself to try something new and then being able to succeed at it. So that's my little fun fact for today. But enough about me. We're going to get started with today's conversation, and we'll be talking about the why with HQIM, understanding why high quality instructional materials and the implementation of them matters, as well as the different conditions for success. You're going to learn about and discuss those conditions so that we can have a successful implementation, as well as hearing from our panelists, learnings from the field. So you're going to be hearing from a district leader, as well as instruction support providers such as Jamar and Jignasha, as well as myself and Stephanie, who are from the curriculum publishing side. And as well as, of course, Q&A towards the end of this discussion, so that you can also be able to make some connections and receive some resources that will help you to effectively implement these high quality instructional materials. So let's continue. And I'm going to turn this over to you, Jignasha, so that you can let our audience know a little bit more about Pivot Learning.
Yeah. All right, and I'll promise to keep this really short. So at Pivot, we believe that all students should have access to quality grade level instruction. And so we work with educators to ensure academic rigor for all students. And we do this by supporting teaching, providing proactive interventions, and supporting districts with aligned district systems. So the last piece, the aligned district systems, is what we're going to be speaking to more as this webinar continues. Jabar's going to take from here.
Yep, thank you. Yep, and so throughout this work that Jignasha just kind of mentioned, we support leaders in selecting and using high quality instructional materials, working alongside you and improving systems to ensure support for every learner, as well as proactively learning from the great work out there in the field and assisting together, leading on issues to improve student outcomes, as well as helping schools achieve educational justice.
So all in all, we support districts implementing a coherent instructional system. We know that the impact of high quality curricula can raise the bar for all students, but to do so, we need to have a system that speaks to all levels of the district, from central office all the way down to the classrooms, in adoption and implementation of high quality instructional material. So on our slide, you can see the myriad of services we provide. And again, we'll be focusing on how do we support with management of implementation of high quality materials. You're on mute, Nainika.
Sorry, I was trying to have Zoom etiquette while you were talking. But now we're going to kind of move into why those high quality materials and that implementation matters. So let's continue with that.
All right, so take a moment to reflect on the information distributed. Students of color and those in high poverty schools have inequitable access to grade level materials. Going a little deeper, 38% of classrooms with mostly students of color have no access to grade level assignments. 70% of assignments in high poverty schools are not on grade level. This is what makes our work even more urgent. Access to high quality materials and instruction is an anti-racist act. All students deserve to experience rigorous instruction and high expectations. But recent research tells us that students of color and students from low wealth communities often don't. Educators are eager to know more and do better, and we can help.
The crux of our argument is that materials matter. If you are serious about equitable instruction for all students, then selecting a high quality instructional material is important. And apologies, I have an uninvited guest, my dog in the background. So the evidence is clear that instructional interactions between students and teachers are framed by the instructional materials that are provided in their schools and districts. So the impact of, you keep hearing us keep saying high quality instructional material. Well, the impact of these materials is as limited as the coherent system that may or may not be in place at your district. So as you can see from the graphic to the right, high quality instructional curriculum and tools is just one prong of the puzzle. You also need a well-articulated curriculum-based professional learning that will enable the different players in your system, your teachers, your site leaders, your coaches, to actually implement this high quality instructional material. But you also need to measure progress. And the one way you can do that is by regular observation and feedback. All of those three things in tandem is what's going to amplify the impact and power of a high quality instructional material. And so that is what we're going to talk to you about today, is what are those conditions for success that will enable you to get the most out of the high quality instructional materials.
So what we have today is, we're going to spotlight Monterey Peninsula. And as you can see on the screen there, and I'm going to have Sean come off mute and talk, to this slide and, how MPUSD began to implement Ready Classroom in the 2019-2020 school year. And we know everything that was going on with that school year. So please, Sean, let us know, tell us a little bit more about your district and, why you decided to move forward with this adoption of Ready Classroom Math.
Thanks, Anika. Yeah, I want to start just by thanking all the educators for coming together for this webinar, and to say that, by my presence here, I'm not here to say that MPUSD has got it right or has got it figured out, but that we've had some experiences that we want to share. As you can see, we're a moderately sized district, but we have a high percentage of students that are economically disadvantaged or students of color. We also have a significant amount of linguistic diversity and a relatively high degree of teacher turnover, because living here on the peninsula is an expensive proposition. So we do tend to kind of move through teachers, which emphasizes why some of this work is so important. When we were really thinking about the Ready for Rigor framework and the way it intersected with what was happening in our middle school math program, we were finding that the community of learners wasn't where it needed to be. And that, as Jignashi was talking about, the curriculum frames the interaction between the teachers and the students. And the curriculum was part of the problem in that it wasn't setting students up for success in a way that discourse and conceptual understanding was at the center of the work. So that was a big motivator for us. As you say, Nanika, as you pointed out, the 2019-2020 school year was fraught. It was the beginning of COVID for us. So throughout our time today, I want to kind of talk about launch and relaunch, because we really feel like in a lot of ways we're in relaunch. We have a number of new teachers. We were teaching the curriculum in an environment, distance learning, where it wasn't designed, where it's centered on relationships and discourse, which everybody in this room knows, that was made more complicated by the DL experience.
Right, exactly. And on this next slide, I really wanted to highlight your district's vision statement and how that really tied into your search for those high quality instructional materials, as well as being able to implement them with fidelity. Because we know that a big portion of what we see here is really about encouraging discourse and really making instruction equitable for all students. So please, definitely speak to that, for what we're seeing here on this slide.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to grab onto what Jamar was talking about with when he was talking about the opportunity myth. We saw that playing out in real ways in MPUSD in terms of differential outcomes for students of color, students of linguistic diversity, students without the opportunities for wealth that some of their same age peers had. And so our focus around students was really about that positive math identity and improving outcomes. Our outcomes weren't and aren't where we want them to be. Our educators, and you can see there in the second piece of our vision, our educators, we really wanted a program that was going to center authentic problem solving and math discourse. And then we really felt like from an equity standpoint, students being able to bring their funds of knowledge into the experience, our teachers weren't equipped with the tools to do that. And then one of our principals really wanted us to get this idea of joy in our math classrooms, and thinking about the cultural relevance of joy in those classrooms. And so you can see that in our math educators, where our adults needed to shift mindsets. And you can see that in the third space to the point where they could get into a belief space around what students were capable of. Because we do find that disconnect, particularly when we're coming into a year where we have a lot of unfinished teaching and a lot of unfinished learning, and we can see a lot of over scaffolding that comes from adult beliefs and biases. So we wanted to do the internal work as a team to really think about student capacity and how that can be limited at times by our vision for student capacity.
And that's so important because part of that equity discussion has to be giving students access to that grade level material. So as
100%.
Jamar did mention earlier, when he talked about that, when you looked at those statistics, there's too often many students, especially in low income areas and primarily Black and Brown students, are not necessarily being given that access. And we at Curriculum Associates really believe in this program that you've decided to implement, because a large part of it is based on that discourse and giving students that voice in the classroom. So if we are able to give them opportunities to share with each other, then they can learn from each other as well. And I think that's really important when we're doing this work as educators. So let's take a look at those high quality material, the implementation and what those conditions for success are. Jignasha?
Yep. So as Sean mentioned, you as a district, right, you are in this place where you want to do right by the kids and you're addressing the systemic inequities, and you have adopted a high quality instructional material and you're rolling it out. And what we see districts do more often than not is put a lot of energy on the adoption and not do as much thinking on the back end around the implementation. And in our work, we've identified 6 conditions that we want to offer up today that we think are important to have in place to ensure that you will see the impact that you're hoping with the adoption of high quality instructional material. So number 1 is resource, sponsor, and manage the implementation at the highest level of leadership. You need leadership buy-in top down. And if for your district this means school board, then it needs to go all the way up to the school board. Basically, what we're saying is it needs to be district priority, and everyone should be in on this secret. It should be an open secret that high quality instructional materials are district priority. In terms of what it means to sponsor and manage, this can no longer be just the job of your curriculum and instruction director. This has to include leaders across all the different pillars of your district. So that means communication, PL, data, and also your site leaders. Do not forget about your site leaders and your coaches and your teachers. They are the ones doing the work. So they need to be part of your team in managing this work.
I love that you mentioned and you pulled in all of those, players, because it's not just going to be one group of people that do that. Thank you for that.
Yeah, this is truly all hands on deck, and it needs to be all hands on deck. And then the second piece that's connected to the initial beginning is resourcing and executing what we call an intentional launch. It cannot be that your teachers walk in and, ooh, there's a new curriculum. Great, I will just turn around and implement it. There needs to be intentional training, intentional communication, and engagement of stakeholder. basically you're building a foundation because for a work that's going to sustain itself for multiple years, because this is not one and done. And Sean will speak to this. This is not a 1 year, you did it and great, moving on. Also, this addresses what many times many players in the system experience, which is change fatigue. So when you have an intentional launch, you're saying, hey, we are committed and we are making sure that we are bringing you along for this change and you are a part of it. So what does that include? Forming your implementation team, as we mentioned, needs to be cross-functional, needs to have players across the different pillars of your system. You need to conduct a robust needs assessment. We are not coming to a blank slate. You already have systems in place at your district. And so you need to do the assessment of how are they working? What are they? Are they implicit? Are they explicit? Where are the inequities built in so that you can address them intentionally? You are setting a very clear instructional vision, goal, and strategy. And Sean gave us a really great example of what an instructional vision could look like. And then, of course, it's kind of the technical pieces of you have to manage the project and the work. So who are your owners? What are your deadlines? How are you measuring progress? And how are you engaging in those continuous cycles of improvement? And ultimately, you're building a system for sustainability. Ideally, you're in a system that does not experience too much turnover and change. But as Sean mentioned, this is true for the Bay Area. You're in a system where outside factors make it tricky to hold on to your people. So you need to build a system that is not going to go away with that turnover. And you're able to address that turnover too, right? And so building systems for sustainability. Nanika, back to you.
Thank you. So we're going to talk about this based on what Jignasha just shared with us, the different strengths and challenges from your launch. And, you know, I'm glad that you brought this up, Sean, because you said it was like a launch and then a relaunch, because everything pretty much had to start over with this, you know, this new normal that we're in presently. So please feel free to give us some of the lessons that you learned. What were some of those strengths and those challenges?
Yeah, and I think that the first thing that I wanted to call out was one of the things that Jignasha said around the needs assessment. I wish that I could see all the participants on the webinar because I imagine I'm about to see some heads nod. But in MPUSD, in terms of the C&I work, you know, it all goes through one person. It all basically goes through, you know, one office. And, you know, I have team members that support me, but when we did our needs assessment, we realized right away we couldn't do it on our own and that we needed additional support to make it work. So, you know, we started by looking at external partnerships, including Curriculum Associates, Core, and Pivot, so that we could get off on the right foot. And then we built a team, and our implementation team includes our middle school principals, our academic coaches. We have middle school teachers on that. We do have our communications director for the district, our data and assessment director for the district. They are all part of that team. And in terms of strengths, like having strong leadership at the principal level was a strength that we were able to leverage. Both principals, APs, and coaches, we had those assets in place. But I can't emphasize enough that leadership is key in this work. When you're talking about everything else that we're going to be talking about, when you're talking about cycles of continuous improvement, professional development, that all starts at the site leader. I can't change anything from my office at the district. It's really the site leaders that are in there. And so, you know, a challenge for us is, while Jignasha is talking about, you know, it's not one and done and you need to have the training, there's a lot of training and it's diverse. So we're working on coaching our coaches. We're working on training our principals so that they understand, and our assistant principals, when I'm in a lesson, what am I supposed to be seeing? What's the paradigm shift that takes place as this curriculum comes on board? How do I +1 the experience for teachers that are in different spaces in terms of their experience, their capacity, and their mental models around what math instruction looks like? So the last piece I kind of intersect here is this idea when we're talking about program PD not being enough, it isn't enough. Because especially when you're changing something like math, you know, the way that changes, and Nanika, you highlighted the idea of discourse. That's been an area we've had to continually focus on, because discourse as center to a math program was a mental model shift and continues to be a mental model shift for our teachers, both at the middle and at the elementary level, where we're also doing this work. So you have to have a comprehensive approach that includes both of those pieces.
Exactly. And then I know that in prior discussions that I've had, even looking at middle school teachers being sometimes reluctant to use manipulatives in the classroom. So even giving them the space to really, you know, try these things and giving them the support that they need. Actually, I want Stephanie to be able to speak to that because, you know, from our side of things at Curriculum Associates, how did we support, you know, how do we support that when districts are going through not just a curriculum change, but just a shift in general in how teachers need to teach? Go right ahead.
I mean, everything Sean said, A, and then B, you know, we really think about implementation much like Sean described and like our partners from Pivot have described. It takes everybody. It takes district leadership. It takes school leadership. It takes teachers, right? It is like you have to feed the entire ecosystem in order to enact the change and bring in the new curriculum. So I would say for us, when we're thinking about launching with a district, you know, the challenge is immense of changing the way that you teach mathematics, right, at all levels of the system. And I think part of what we do with district leaders at launch is try to choose a couple of goals versus trying to boil the ocean, right? We've tried to focus, we lay out a vision of what good implementation looks like, and then we try to dial it back to one or two things in that first year, which I think helps everybody, you know, the district, the ecosystem of providers, us, bring focus to what is going on. And oftentimes in the first year, those two things wind up being use the stuff, right? Like stop using all the different disparate things that you've been using, you know, before, and to really focus on discourse, which Sean mentioned. And, you know, I think we work really closely with districts to make sure we do get access to school leaders like Sean was talking about, because again, the principals control time and attention in a school building. Like I'm a former district administrator too, and I know the principals would nod when I talk to them. I don't necessarily know that they would go back to their buildings and do what we talked about. So you have to create that belief and buy-in among school leaders, right? And also like create a vision for them, not just about implementation, but what it looks like to be the instructional leader or to work hand in hand with a coach or another instructional leader to understand what the change looks like. And finally, with the teachers, like obviously at launch, the teachers need to know what the stuff is, right? Like they need to know what the program is. They need to understand the fundamentals. But so much of it at launch is, like Sean said, about mind shift, building belief, building a vision of what it looks like to teach math differently, which if you're a teacher who's been teaching a traditional program for years and years, like this is terrifying. And so how do we begin to build teachers' comfort and belief in a different way of teaching that is more equitable, right? That does have these really strong social emotional components. And in the launch here, again, we set small, but like monumental goals, right? In order to begin to make that progress that you need for it to take foot over multiple years of an implementation.
Right. And thank you so much for that, because it really does speak to how many different parts, moving parts there are. It's not just about getting these new books. It's about changing mindsets. It's about giving teachers the support that they need, the instructional coaches the support they need. Everyone needs a different type of support to be able to see this, you know, to fruition and to get the results that you're looking for. So let's move on. I'm gonna have Jamar come in and talk to us about conditions number 3 and 4.
Thank you, Nanika. So traditionally, professional learning has been only one day or a few days of training, mostly on materials adopted. Professional learning has not been job embedded, nor has it been ongoing. Typically only happens at the beginning of the first adoption year. So in our work, it is essential that district and school leadership teams develop and successfully execute a job embedded ongoing professional learning strategy, plan, and calendar. Training should cover materials and assessment, pedagogy, and equity in materials and instruction. Although trainings are important, professional learning should also be job embedded with support at and across sites and classrooms. This should also be collaborative and include your site leaders, instructional coaches, and teachers. Professional learning should be provided when materials are adopted and ongoing. Curriculum implementation is a multi-year process.
Absolutely is. And what about number 4 here?
Yep. So educators need to see that districts are listening and responding to them. And it's times that I know we get busy. It's times that we might get some feedback that we might not know how to answer, but it is important that in some way or another, we respond to the educator feedback. And if feasible, communicate to them, whether we can't speak upon it now, but it really, matters to those school leaders that their feedback is heard. And so to ensure that high quality instructional materials are implemented, knowledge and mindset, investment and ownership of educators is key. 4 considerations for communication and engagement strategy and plan are focusing on the why with a strong message about how high quality materials and instruction align, and best practices and being an equity lever, as well as communicate early and frequently about the vision and plan for materials and instruction, professional learning, and assessment. And this involves everyone, it's including the team throughout this whole process, and regularly demonstrating that as a district, we have investment and ownership, along with providing high quality professional learning for these educators as we gather data and make changes iteratively. For the work to be successful, it requires a big lift from the educators. Quality is especially essential in this process.
Thank you so much, Jamar. And I think it's so important to really understand that district investment and ownership, right? So this is not just, oh, we're gonna just throw a few $1,000s, few $100,000 or millions of dollars, out the window. We are making an investment and we want to see a return on that investment, right? So Sean, I just wanted to find out from you, some of those best practices that we talked about, just thinking about, getting our teachers to understand. Obviously, on our side of things, we're trying to help them understand the philosophy behind the program, but also for you as a district, why this philosophy matters, what this is really going to do as far as making things more equitable for all students.
Yeah, it's interesting that communication is number 4. In some ways, it should probably be number 1. And I think about the way we've communicated throughout this process. Just in the adoption space, and that was a few years ago now for us. We started at the teacher level, and Jamar's talked a couple of times about teacher feedback being key. And we talk about teacher buy-in. I really want to surface that any change comes with identity threat to teachers, and understanding where they're sitting, where their context is in that change is important. And so the more we can have them at the table in every space, and then communicating really transparently and clearly, has been key for us. Our implementation team, we had our math leadership team involved in the adoption, and then as we've moved into this relaunch phase, supported by Pivot and Core, we've developed our implementation team. And we met yesterday, and that meeting was really about looking at the first quarter of our year and everything that we've engaged in terms of our professional learning plan, and really gathering feedback and hearing about what was working. And that was from our leaders, from our coaches, from our teachers, so that we could course correct. Even in this early moment, in what way do we need to course correct? Because communicating isn't just about days and dates, it's about the listening part and what's the experience that they're having. And I think we often get that experience in terms of surveying around curriculum, or we get it around, getting a PD survey at the end, but really having a team with refined expertise and strong facilitation, be able to communicate in really succinct ways about adjustments that we need to make is super important. When we think about our PD plan, we have a 3-year plan, and that 3-year plan includes pedagogy training that's always in context of the curriculum. It includes integrity walks with our leadership. It includes leadership capacity building and program planning, where we get the opportunity to develop site-specific problems of practice to be able to be really refined. We have a district vision, But we also need to have a site vision because every site has their own context and they need to engage with that vision and engage in developing that vision so that it becomes a part of their action, a part of the work that they're doing on a daily basis as they're in classroom. So we know that we intend to do this work for 3 years and it's having an impact, at all levels of the system in terms of how we think about curriculum.
Right. And we know that you have this 3-year plan as well, right? So Stephanie, let's speak to how we would be able to support this, happening in action in a district, such as Sean's.
Yeah, I mean, we once again share the belief that Sean stated that, professional learning for a new math curriculum needs to be ongoing. It can't just be one and done. I think that sometimes as a publisher, the impulse is one to want to be able to tell districts like, oh, like it's easy, but like it's not easy. It's really hard changing the way you fundamentally teach mathematics. And I think as a publisher, we choose to lean into that and offer districts help and solutions versus leaning away from it, which, is the honest way to do this, which then allows us to collaborate authentically with districts and with other providers like Pivot, again, to think about, in some ways, every implementation is the same. In some ways, every implementation is completely different. And I think, over the years at CA, we're getting much better at understanding what are the commonalities among implementations, but then we also do PD always at the site level, not just at the district level. Again, because Sean said every site is slightly different. And so you have to be able to, again, bring the structure of having as the provider who's like implementing this program thousands of times nationally, bringing the learnings you have at that global level while also having the humility to listen at the individual and at the site level to make changes. And I'll tell one quick story about this. Like the very first year that we were implementing the predecessor to Ready Classroom Mathematics called Ready Math, teachers were really like, discourse is such at the heart of our program, and teachers were really not seeing the vision of what it looked like to do discourse in the classroom. And we were hearing this, we were seeing it in PD. And interestingly, the instructional routine that lies at the heart of Ready Classroom Mathematics came out of that teacher feedback of needing a structure in which to see how discourse played out versus just being told discourse is important. Here are some questions. And I love that story because I think it sits at the heart of how, as a publisher, we evolve to understand, like, not just we're telling people, hey, NCTM says discourse is good, you should do it, but bringing to life what it looks like in ways that then allow us to have actionable collaboration with districts and in classrooms to, again, like move from theory to practice.
So it's so important for feedback. Feedback is probably the most valuable part of this process. It's the same thing when you're in the classroom, you're teaching these students. You want to get some of that feedback as well. You need to be able to understand what they do know, what they don't know. And that's also part of the reason why discourse is so important. A teacher can learn a lot by the discussions that are taking place in the classroom when they hear, their students talking about math. They know the different misconceptions that they may have. So in a way, they're getting feedback, even though it may not have been direct, but that's also going to inform their instruction, what they're going to do next. And like you said, Stephanie, getting that feedback from teachers is how we improve so that we can also give a great program that's going to meet the needs of not just the teachers, but the students that they teach as well. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to move on to the next. And I believe that's going to be, is that you, Jignasha, that you're going to talk about?
It is me, yeah.
Awesome.
We had the final two conditions for success.
Yes.
And I love that we are talking about feedback, because one of the things we have noticed in our work with districts is they get feedback, but they don't always know how to prioritize the feedback. And that brings me to having your systems for measuring impact, so you know where you're slating in the analysis of your feedback. So let me kind of back up. So one of the conditions for success for a district to have a successful implementation is to have a short-term and long-term plan for measuring progress. And it needs to be coherent and needs to be speaking again to the building of systems. So Nanika, you mentioned if I'm a teacher and I'm seeing this piece with student around discourse, how are we kind of mining that data across the different classrooms in year one to make sense of where are we on the integrity spectrum, or where are the common misconceptions, so that we can make iterations to our PL to come back to the teachers and then, measure again. So you see me drawing circles in the air. So that's our cycles of continuous improvement.
Right.
And all of this means that a district needs to kind of sit down and thoughtfully decide what are your high quality measurement tools. Yes, you're going to have your benchmark data. You should also be leveraging curriculum-based assessments, and they're going to be other quality indicators. So how are you triangulating all of this data and not just getting buried in that data? Earlier in the conversation, folks were also talking about mindset shift, which is so necessary and important, and one of the trickiest things to measure. So again, this evaluation strategy needs to think about how are you assessing and quantifying impact on educator learning, so adult learning, and mindset shifts, instructional practice, so change in attitudes and practices and skills, and then ultimately, obviously, student learning and engagement. And that brings us to our final condition for success, which is, of course, not an exhaustive list, but something that we continue to see as really important, is prioritizing and planning for sustainability from day one. You're making a massive investment, multi-million dollars, multiple years, financial resources, personnel resources, and you don't want that excitement to go away. Change management is tricky. Folks are going to hit the wall at some point. And so you need to have this plan for sustainability that plans for this and ensures that all of the work and investment you as a district have made, you will continue. You will continue to bear fruit year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, and until, when you update your curricula. So what does that mean? There are technical and adaptive pieces. Technical pieces, you have your data system, you have your PL calendar, you know who is doing what, you have meetings, all of that. But then the adaptive pieces, you have a strategic plan for increasing capacity internally. I joke with Sean that I'm happy to kind of continue working with Monterey for years and years to come. But ideally, I would have done my job well when I'm sunsetted and, they kind of give a little farewell and they're able to continue the work. They are able to put the practices in play and kind of continue to grow leadership within their own system. So all of this, again, kind of speaks back to how our districts thinking about and investing and managing in the ongoing continuous improvement to ensure that they are kind of reaping the dividends on their investment.
Right, really building that capacity for that to be able to exist throughout. So
right.
When we're thinking about that, I'm sorry, I forgot to advance here, because I think this is really important, how you see that cycle of implementation,
exactly,
improvement. Because I know that Sean did also mention doing some of those walkthroughs and giving administrators an opportunity and maybe even teachers to be able to see what's happening in other classrooms, so that there can be all of that great information coming back to you. And, if you need to do a reset or change things a little bit, because again, we have to be adaptive. I mean, if COVID hasn't shown us that, I don't know what will. We had to be able to adapt. So thank you so much for really, hitting that point there, Jignasha, because it's important. We can start out with one thing, at the very beginning, and we have to realize that sometimes we're going to have to do some changing.
Right. Yeah. And then if I can quickly give a preview for this slide and then pass on the mic. So what folks are seeing here is a framework for a high quality implementation. And so Nanika, you mentioned this walkthroughs, they'll tell you what is happening in the classrooms. Again, not to do a gotcha moment with your educators, but to understand where are the disconnects with integrity. And then taking that data for data review and planning in what we call a program planning day, which is upcoming for Monterey, and to identify your problem of practice. I think Stephanie spoke to this. There are a lot of things when you're implementing a curriculum, but you need to focus on what are the things, the 1 to 2 things you're going to do year 1, and kind of measure progress against it. And then, of course, the instructional rounds, which is where more data is collected on your problem of practice to then inform site leader action, teacher action, but also district action. So going back to implementation plan and seeing Are there any gaps? Do you need to make changes to your PL? Do you need to make changes to your data? So yes, this is an example of the cycle of continuous improvement that we are implementing and we are seeing success with.
Great. So speaking of that, Sean, I'm going to come back to you so that you can give us, some of that feedback about how this has worked for you, especially with the changes that we've had to deal with over the past 1.5 years. So, what is your approach to sustaining that multi-year implementation, considering that you probably had to do a couple of pivots to really be able to do that? And like you said, launch and then relaunch with the beginning of this school year, now that there is in-person learning, right? So speak to that for us today.
I appreciate the contextualized handoff. I think that I want to take measurement, and then I want to take sustainability. And one of the things that we've really learned with regard to measurement is that it's about context and it's about elevation. I talked a little bit about identity threat earlier, and Jignasha mentioned, teachers feeling gotcha moments. Everybody out there, this would be another one of those head nod moments. I was just reading something from Zaretta Hammond that was, that echoed what our experience was here at MPUSD, that everybody's feeling stressed. And in a lot of ways, they're feeling more stressed this year than they did last year. Because last year we went into a weird space and everybody knew it was a weird space. This year we're in a normal space that's not a normal space. And so everybody can see where the edges are chipped and broken, the dysregulation of students. And the context is, there's one of sensitivity, and especially when you're in the change management process. So we're looking at our measurement and thinking about the elevation of that. And so we're not in a space where we're sort of monitoring at the student data level right now, because that's a really threatening space as people are emerging and growing. And we've been, like many districts have been, in a restorative restart where we're really focused on SEL. So we're building the infrastructure, but thinking about the long game with regard to the implementation and not looking for overnight wins in the data. When we think about measurement from a walkthrough perspective, that was a really great experience in that our principals were able to see, I've got a bunch of immediate needs, both in myself. They were doing their mirror work around their understanding of the curriculum, and then they were also doing their windows work in terms of what they were seeing from the teachers and how the students and teachers were intersecting with the materials. So that was a big piece of that work from a measurement perspective, and they had action steps. Then we were sitting behind them and we were watching how they were processing, and that was information for us in terms of our leader professional learning plan, which manifested in a number of significant steps that we're in process of taking right now, because with the leaders, there's less of a potential for identity threat. And so we could be kind of more in the moment with the leaders, where they were working through their change management process with their teachers. When it comes to the sustainability piece, we're really kind of taking a two-pronged approach. One is making sure that this work is touching all of our systems. So for example, we have our academic coaches. They meet on, every other week they come together. We've been doing a book study on UDL. So we put UDL in the context of Ready Classroom with our academic coaches in our last academic coaches meeting, so that they could think about how that framework intersects with this curriculum, and then get into a headspace of how do I support teachers with this? Because there's going to be a lot of continuity in that system, and that's going to be able to carry forward. So any learning that we do in the sort of roots of what our structures already are, but we just have to be intentional as district leaders about making sure that we're intersecting with those spaces so that folks are having those experiences. And then, as I alluded to earlier, we're following along with a K-5 adoption, and we're taking this model of learning that we're doing in our 6-8, 7-8 space and saying, how does this inform the work that we're doing with K-5? Do we have an analogous experience for our elementary leaders, for our elementary teachers, as we do in this work that CORE and Pivot have been helping us with along the way?
Right. And that's so important, that cohesiveness that you just spoke to. And, I know that Stephanie heard that, that reference to social emotional learning, and her ears just perked up, even though I can't see her ears. I know they did. So I'm going to have you speak to that as well as for, from a publisher standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, on the SEL piece specifically, our entry point this year for working with school leaders and encouraging them in their work with teachers was around SEL. Again, like, how do you return to school and have your priority be rebuilding a classroom community, a school-wide community of learning, right? Versus like jumping into panic over unfinished learning, right? Like, we, along with Ready Classroom, provide iReady, which is a diagnostic assessment. And, in this year of all years, what we believe and the message we need to communicate to educators is data is your friend for prioritization. It is your friend for setting goals with students and allowing them to own their own learning goals and having the, building student self-efficacy. Discourse is your friend, all these things, but like the data is a tool. It's not like something here. It's not the hammer, it's like a nice tool. So all of that resonated with me, what Sean was saying again about, we need the data to be a teacher's partner and not just an evaluation tool. And that's something we're working really hard on, in particular with school leaders this year, of like, understand where you are vis-a-vis unfinished learning, but your priority is having kids talking to each other about math in the classroom, right? That is how you do social and emotional learning in action while building grade level content knowledge. And in terms of sustainability, really quickly, I mean, I think, our job, we believe at Curriculum Associates, like our job isn't to like sell you a curriculum. Our job is to have you be successful using the curriculum, right? And so that piece around sustainability is really important to us. Like, I feel better, even though I'm like technically selling less professional learning in an implementation, if the focus of that professional learning is with coaches and school leaders and less with teachers than in the early days, I know we're doing our job well, right? So it is looking for that. How are we continuing to get coaches and leaders better and better at owning the implementation? We're touching teachers to give them information they need to be successful. But again, we are being brought in for a specific purpose versus like, we need somebody to do professional learning on Ready Classroom. And like, for us, that's what feels really successful.
Thank you, Stephanie. What we're going to do in the interest of time is I'm going to have Jamar just kind of, summarize for us those 6 conditions again, because I did want to be able to, take a question if there are any questions that came up from, from the audience. So please, Jamar, just let us know. These are those 6 things that we need to be thinking about. Go right ahead and give us some insight on that.
Yes, thank you. And first, I want to thank you, Sean, and his team in Monterey Peninsula. I mean, as we think about this work, high quality instructional material implementation is very difficult work. And as a district team and school leaders and educators, they've all been working hard to, all of those conditions to ensure that they're taking everything they have, resourcing all of their resources, thinking who are the players, thinking about an implementation plan that looks at the professional learning and ensuring that we're prioritizing teachers' needs, as well as thinking about communication. Who are we communicating? What is the timeline for this communication? And how do individual school communities respond to this communication? As well as thinking about measuring our work, thinking about the immediate and long-term effects, but then also measuring the work to make iterations and really thinking about what is best for our teachers in this moment, as well as we all mentioned, planning for sustainability. So really working alongside this team to build their capacity, because as Ignacia mentioned, our goal is to almost work ourselves out of a job in order for us to help you take on the next initiative. And so as we set up those conditions of success, Sean, I commend you and your team for continuously working on improvement and going through these steps with us.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jamar. And I do think that, as Sean did mention before, communication is key. So although it is number 4 on the list, it's something that's taking place throughout this entire process. So that's really important, that transparency and that buy-in. But I just wanted to be able to just pause for a moment there to see if there were any, questions that came up in the chat that maybe, maybe even for you, Sean, I'm sure maybe some of the attendees are thinking, okay, so you basically launched and then had to relaunch. What was a lot of that, the challenges that came with that, of course, because you asked them to do something the year before, and we had no idea what was going to happen, then you ended up having to send folks home. So then how did it really, change your plan when it came time to come back in this fall?
Yeah, and I think, nothing focuses your attention more than a crisis. And I think that, for the school leaders that are on the call, the last year, particularly the distance learning year, there was a constant churn of really high elevation, really big rock kinds of things that we were needing to deal with. And it didn't really allow for time to think about, like, what does math look like in DL? What does, ELA look like in DL? It was just sort of like, what does DL look like and how do we keep everybody safe and educated? Mm-hmm. Coming back, what we realized and why we've gotten so serious about this implementation plan is that people are learning every day, whether there's teaching going on or not. And our teachers were learning ways of using the materials that weren't really the way that the materials were designed and weren't with pedagogical structures that were going to continue to make sense now that we were back in person. And that's not just the in-person, but that's also with the SEL and the cultural responsive pieces that needed to happen that weren't able to happen in the same way in the past. So the reboot was about saying, as we come back into normal, and normal's a weird word, right? But this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to shed some of what wasn't working in the past. And Jamar talked about equity. Equity is always our driver. It's always our center. It's always our why, because as long as our outcomes are predictable for students, and they're predictable based on zip code and demographic and language, that's on us. Every system gets the result that it was designed to produce. And if we continue to produce inequitable outcomes, that points at us. And so we knew that this was our moment to get with the right partners and do the right work to be able to move the system forward in a way that everything that's gone on for the past 18 to 24 months can ultimately have a benefit on our students, as opposed to just be a story that we tell a decade from now, because this moment is the moment where you can make those kinds of changes. And so we needed to really get serious about a long-term plan with these elements to be able to do that work.
And very quickly, I just wanted to ask you one more question that did come up that I think is really important. I know we have like 1 minute, but what are the steps, tools, and resources that you use to support the integrity walks with the leaders? That was a question that came up. I thought that was really good. That should be answered.
Well, I just muted myself to unmute myself. Welcome to Zoom. In the short time that we have, basically what we did was, with the support of Pivot, was that we had a tool that was really kind of a bifurcated tool. And the first thing that we did was work with leaders around what lesson are we seeing and what should it look like. And then we were able to identify some integrity descriptors that we decided upon in advance, that we said, within our context, these are the things that are going to make sense for us to see. Then what we did was we challenged ourselves to look at some quality indicators. If X is in place, then how do we measure the quality of X? And the interesting challenge there was, in some places we were seeing the curriculum, but it wasn't being used the way it was intended. And so it made it difficult to measure quality. But by having that as framing, what should we be seeing, and then how might we rate what we're seeing, it catalyzed the discussion that led us toward what our next steps would be. And I know that's a narrow response to the question, but the key pieces were getting the leaders in the curriculum, and then having what should it look like and what could it look like as our kind of thinking spaces, and then being able to have that discussion across all of our middle schools.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you. I know we're really short on time. We're actually over by 1 minute, and I do want to respect our attendees' time. But please do know that both Pivot Learning as well as Curriculum Associates are here to partner with you to help you with, determining what that high quality implementation would look like, those high quality instructional materials. And again, feel free to connect with us. There's an email address there for Pivot Learning, and you can always visit us over at curriculumassociates.com. And I just want to thank our panelists once again. Thank you so much, Sean, Jamar, Jignasha. Thank you. It's been lovely working with you. And of course, Stephanie, you're a rock star. Thank you so much for all of you. And thank you to all the educators for what you do on a daily basis. Thank you for joining us for this hour today. And we look forward to working with you some more. Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.